back. This video is going to walk you through some ideas from a paper that I wrote a few years ago called Fallacies and Phronesis. Sorry, Phronesis and Fallacies. I guess with a conjunct, the order of the conjunction doesn't really matter for the logical meaning, and maybe there's some point to that. So it's a paper I presented at a conference on reasoning, informal reasoning or informal logic conference in Lisbon a few years ago, and it was subsequently published in their proceedings of the conference. So let me just read here the kind of the abstract, and then we'll get into the paper. So in this paper, I'm going to argue for three things. One, informal fallacies are primarily practical and particular, as opposed to theoretical and general. The technique that one uses to identify fallacies will be deeply intertwined with one's practical wisdom, or phronesis. And then three, the way in which students learn the skills of argumentation, are taught to identify and avoid fallacies, as well as restructure arguments containing such fallacies, must take this into account. Okay, so it's kind of a pedagogical component to this. All right, introduction. So standard logic textbooks, for example, Patrick Hurley's A Concise Introduction to Logic, often distinguish between formal fallacies, for example, denying the antecedent or undistributed middle, and informal fallacies, for example, appeal to pity or straw man, in ordinary language argumentation. In evaluating an argument, formal fallacies can be identified by looking at the logical structure of an argument, while informal fallacies require a different type of insight in order to see that they are fallacious or unreasonable. So this paper will explore the type of rational insight needed to identify informal fallacies. Logic texts such as Hurley's usually help students identify informal fallacies by providing a definition of a particular informal fallacy, followed by clear cases which exemplify the fallacy. This mode of insight for students learning to identify informal fallacies seems to be one in which they pick out the fallacy in ordinary occurrences, for example, television commercials, debates, interviews, etc. Students simply look back to the definitions and examples in a textbook context, right? So that's, you take a class in informal fallacies, here's a fallacy, straw man, here's 2 or 3 examples, and then you're given a quiz, and you look to see if the example of the text matches the quiz question, and you're like, oh, that looks like an informal fallacy of straw man, or whatever it is. So in this paper, I want to argue that such an approach to argumentation and fallacy identification is incomplete. I want to argue that for the following 3 ideas, I want to argue for 3 ideas here. First, informal fallacies, as opposed to formal fallacies, fall within a category of reasoning and argumentation which is primarily practical and particular, as opposed to theoretical and general. Second, since informal fallacies deal primarily with practical reasoning, the technique that one uses to identify them will be deeply intertwined with one's practical wisdom, or phronesis. And since informal fallacies deal with practical reasoning and practical wisdom, phronesis, the way in which students learn the skills of argumentation are taught to identify and avoid fallacies, as well as restructure arguments containing fallacies, must take this into account. Now, I guess I'm assuming that students are still learning to identify informal fallacies. First way you can do it is just get an AI to do it, maybe. But, hopefully this will be a skill that human beings will still need. This will entail that philosophers, among others, who teach students the skills of argumentation, must help their students to identify how to cultivate practical wisdom, phronesis, alongside with the kind of theoretical wisdom that often comes with associated with formal logic. Okay, so formal and informal fallacies. This should be a distinction if you've taken a logic class. It should be familiar to you, but here's a little background on that. The teaching of argumentation is commonly divided between formal, categorical logic, symbolic logic, and informal, for example, informal fallacies. In each division, one job of someone teaching is to help students identify and avoid logical errors and or fallacies. Hurley defines a fallacy. This is back to Hurley's kind of standard logic textbook. If you're not familiar with the textbook, it's kind of like Copy's logic text that's been around a while and used. I've used it in multiple classes over the years at multiple institutions. Okay. Hurley defines a fallacy as a defect in an argument that arises from either a mistaken reasoning or the creation of an illusion that a bad argument appears good. He continues by distinguishing between formal and informal fallacies. Formal fallacies may be identified by merely examining the form or structure of an argument, And informal fallacies are those that one can be detected only by examining the content of an argument. So here's an example of an informal fallacy. All plants are things that contain chlorophyll. All factories are plants. Therefore, all factories are things that contain chlorophyll. Now you can't figure out if that's valid. Well, so you can figure out if it's valid formally, right? It's an AAA figure 1 syllogism, which is valid, but it's informally fallacious due to the ambiguity in the word plant, right? So with this type of argument, it's logically okay, but it's not reasonable to make the conclusion, even though it's formally valid. So this commits the fallacy of equivocation. You can only know that this is informally fallacious if you understand the ambiguity in the word plant as it changes from the first to the second premise. Okay, that should be familiar. Okay, here's another example. Atoms are invisible. The Brooklyn Bridge is made of atoms, therefore the Brooklyn Bridge is invisible. So again, it's an AAA figure 1 valid syllogism, but it's informally fallacious due to the presumption that the properties of the parts of the physical object necessarily transfer to the whole object. Thus, it commits the fallacy of composition. Early indicates that to see that this is fallacious, one, quote, must know something about bridges. Namely, that they're large visible objects. I don't think you need a logic class to know that, but there it is. Here's another example. A chess player is a person, therefore a bad chess player is a bad person. It's formally valid, according to Hurley. It indicates he indicates that to detect this fallacy, you have to know something about the meaning of the word bad. Depends on what it modifies, and that being a bad chess player is quite different from being a bad person. Now, I would say, unless playing chess is essential to being human, but okay, I don't think that's true. Surfing, maybe, but just kidding. Okay. Thus, this commits the fallacy of equivocation on the meaning of the word good and its application to persons and chess players. So now here's part 3 here, or section 3. The question that arises is this. How does the way in which one comes to know that an argument is fallacious differ between a formal and an informal fallacy? This is kind of an epistemic question. Given the examples that Hurley gives in the textbook, it seems fairly straightforward to say that formal fallacies can be known generally and theoretically. Some subject S can know that argument A is fallacious by a general test of the formal criteria, for example, Venn diagrams or truth tables. However, when it comes to informal fallacies, the means by which S comes to know that A is fallacious is only by particular and practical means. For example, if one above, the argument above, S only knows that the argument is fallacious if S knows the particular word in the case is ambiguous in the English language. Right? That's the example that we gave of the word plant. If you don't know that that's ambiguous, you're not going to be able to figure it out. It might be hard to tell if you don't know the language. Right? Or for the other example about the bridges, S must have an experience with an actual bridge, or at least have conceptual clarity on the nature of bridges. And in the last example, S must have some understanding of the relationship between the essential nature of chess playing and human beings and good members of each kind. It seems especially the case that in the third argument, the way in which we have knowledge that this argument commits the fallacy of equivocation, or maybe even begging the question, is by means of a kind of wisdom that is not merely theoretical. This is a kind of practical wisdom, which philosophers like Aristotle call Phronesis. Second thing here is that informal fallacies, since they are dealing primarily with practical reasoning, the technique that you use to identify them will be deeply intertwined with one's practical wisdom, or phronesis, also translated as prudence sometimes. So let me give you 4 things here, which Aristotle says about practical wisdom, and then say how these connect with the skill of identifying informal fallacies. Here are 4 things about phronesis. 1. Practical wisdom is, quote, this is quoting Aristotle now, a quality of the mind concerned with things just, noble, and good for man. 2. The function of man, viz., rational activity, is achieved only in accordance with practical wisdom, as well as with moral excellence. So that's an important point. Function there, I think it's dunamos maybe in Greek, but I take that to be purpose or telos, work, I think is how it's often. It could be power, but I think it's the capacity of being human that is essential to us, makes us different from the animals or plants or whatever. This is all in the Nicomachean Ethics. 3. It is impossible to be practically wise without being good. 4. It is not possible to be good in the strict sense without practical wisdom, or practically wise without moral excellence. All right, so now these 4 things give us a picture of the connection between practical wisdom, the essential nature of being human, and the particular inferences that are made in cases like informal fallacies. According to Aristotle, we are essentially rationally active beings whose essences can only be fulfilled or fully actualized with a combination of theoretical, practical, and moral excellences. In fact, Aristotle seems to make a very strong biconditional claim here. S only has practical wisdom if and only if S is morally good. And if Aristotle's right about this, then we have a syllogism here. Well, always got to have a syllogism when you talk about logic. Premise 1. All things that require practical wisdom are things that require moral excellence. All analysis of informal fallacies are things that require practical wisdom. Therefore, all analyses of informal fallacies are things that require moral excellencies. Okay. Section 4. Appeal to pity versus arguments from compassion. So let's turn to a particular fallacy, the appeal to pity fallacy. Here's how Hurley defines that fallacy. So we're going to look at a case here where the question is this fallacious or not? It sounds like a game show. Is this fallacious or not? Fallacy or no? Okay. Here's Hurley's definition of the appeal to pity fallacy. This quote: the appeal to pity fallacy occurs when an arguer attempts to support a conclusion by merely evoking pity from the reader or listener. And here's a textbook example right from Hurley's text. Taxpayer to judge. This is like a little conversation between a taxpayer and a judge. Your Honor, I admit that I declared 13 children as dependents on my tax return, even though I only have 2. But if you find me guilty of tax evasion, my reputation will be ruined. I'll probably lose my job. My wife won't be able to have the operation that she desperately needs, and my kids will starve. Therefore, I'm not guilty of the crime I'm accused of. Okay. So the point of that argument is to show that the external conditions of a loss of reputation or job, not being able to support a family, is irrelevant to the question of whether or not the person is guilty of tax evasion due to overstating his dependents. We can tell whether this argument is fallacious by understanding the conditions of which it means to be guilty or innocent of tax evasion. In this case, following Aristotle's notions of practical wisdom, valuing the argument will require knowledge of those things which are just and noble for the good of the person in question. In fact, some facility of the notion of juridical guilt and innocence, which goes beyond the mere procedural, would surely be required in this case. The thing which makes this particular fallacy, the appeal to pity, so helpful in drawing out Aristotle's ideas of the role of practical wisdom in fallacy identification is that, according to Hurley, the appeal to pity has a clear-cut exception with its own name, at least according to Hurley. Some such non-fallacious arguments are, according to Hurley, arguments from compassion. Okay. Arguments from compassion. So here's some criteria. I don't think this is necessarily exhaustive, but these would be features that you might think look like an appeal to pity, but are an exception to it, that are actually a reasonable inference. And non-fallacious. So criteria 1. These arguments, appeals to compassion, evoke compassion on behalf of some person. 2. They supply information about why that person is generally deserving of help or special consideration. 3. They supply information about why they show that the person in question is a victim of circumstance. 4. They show that the person is not responsible for the dire straits he finds himself in. And 5, they show that the recommended help or special consideration isn't illegal or inappropriate. And 6, that the help suggested will genuinely help the person in question. Okay, those are all 6 criteria there that Hurley says make an argument that might appear like an argument, an appeal to pity, rather a reasonable argument from compassion. So let's consider these 6 criteria. First, there's information needed about why a person deserves help, but to understand why a person needs assistance requires just the type of practical wisdom and moral background information which Aristotle suggests. Second, Hurley indicates that the person seeking help is a victim of circumstances and not responsible. Now, that's a very easy thing to say, but how easy a thing is it to determine? How much background information must someone need in order to determine which circumstances are relevant or what kind of straits one is in, and how much responsibility falls on the person in question? Answer to these kinds of questions require the kind of prudence or phronesis which Aristotle indicates is a necessary fulfillment for human nature. Third, sometimes giving certain kinds of help to someone might be illegal, but nevertheless good or moral. For example, giving refuge in one's home to a dissident fugitive from a vicious political regime. Pick your favorite example, right? It might be illegal, right? It might run contrary to the law of the land you're in, but it might be moral to do. Similarly, some help might be legal, but possibly not morally appropriate, as we'll look at another case of that in a moment. So sorting all this out cannot come merely by examining textbook definitions, and I would suggest it requires practical wisdom in order to distinguish between a fallacious appeal to pity and a non-fallacious argument from compassion. Here's another sort of example. And this is quoting from a video, political advertisement that occurred in the early 2000s. It was a video, insert it into this video here, with Michael J. Fox, who was suffering from a debilitating disease, and made a political advertisement advocating for voting for a particular candidate for governor in the state of Missouri, who is a proponent of stem cell research. The other candidate running against this proponent candidate was opposed to stem cell research, and Michael J. Fox, who's visibly suffering from his condition in the advertisement, asks the listener or viewer of the advertisement to vote for McCaskill instead of Talent, the other person running for governor, based upon their support of McCaskill's support of stem cell research and Talent's opposition to it. So here's a quotation from the ad. As you might know, I care deeply about stem cell research. In Missouri, you can elect Claire McCaskill, who shares my hope for cures. Unfortunately, Senator Jim Talent opposes expanding stem cell research. Senator Talent even wanted to criminalize the science. It gives us a chance for hope. They say all politics is local, but that's not always the case. What you do in Missouri matters to millions of Americans. Okay, so that's the quotation from the ad. It's visually more persuasive, I think, than just reading it, but you can go find it on YouTube. Just Google Michael J. Fox advertisement, political advertisement, McCaskill versus Talent or something like that. Okay. So here's one plausible way to construct this political advertisement as a formal argument, which possibly commits, maybe, and this is the question here, commits the informal fallacy of appeal to pity. Premise 1. In Michael J. Fox's ad and others, if Michael J. Fox and others are suffering from a horrible disease, then it's possible that stem cell research is able to help people like him. Then we should vote for a particular candidate who supports stem cell research. Premise 2. Michael J. Fox and others are suffering. Therefore, it's possible that stem cell research is able to help people like Fox. Therefore, you should vote for McCaskill. Okay, so that's a formally valid argument. The next question is that an appeal to pity or an argument from compassion? Right, so that's kind of the point of this example. So if it were an appeal to pity, then the conclusion would be supported by, according to the criteria from Hurley, merely evoking pity from the reader or listener. If it were a non-fallacious argument from compassion, then the criteria that I read a moment ago, those 6 criteria would have to be met. So here's my claim about all this. Being able to tell whether it's a fallacious appeal to pity or a non-fallacious argument from compassion will hinge on practical insight, practical wisdom into 2 moral questions implicit in this argument regarding stem cell research. So here are the 2 questions that I think you need to have to answer ahead of time. Question 1, does embryonic stem cell research kill human persons? Question 2, is it morally permissible to kill some human persons in order to help other persons who are suffering from debilitating diseases? If the answer to the first question is no, or if the answer to the first question is yes, and the answer to the second question is yes, then this may simply be an argument from compassion, assuming that such research will actually help people, like Fox in the advertisement. That's one of the criteria that Hurley has. However, if the answer to the first question is yes, and the answer to the second question is no, then while this argument appears to meet Hurley's criteria, the first four at least, and maybe the last one, it would certainly violate the fifth one. That was the criteria number 5, which is the recommended help or special consideration isn't illegal or inappropriate. Now, you might say, well, it's legal. It's legal. Even if it were legal, it would be, to put it mildly, inappropriate to kill some people in order to help others who are suffering. In the same way, it would be, to put it mildly, inappropriate to experiment on homeless people in order to find a cure for spinal cord injuries, as depicted in the film Extreme Measures. A film a while back, Gene Hackman and Hugh Grant, I think. If you like bioethics dilemmas, that's a pretty good film example of that. Okay, so this is the question, right? In other words, there's a major moral question regarding stem cell research that if you don't have antecedent answers to, you can't determine if this argument presented in a political ad advocating for voting for a person into political office who thinks that stem cell research is a good thing, right? So the moral questions are antecedent to the questions of answering the moral questions are antecedent to answering questions about fallacious reasoning, I think. That's kind of the point here. Okay, section 5 of the paper. So which is it? An appeal to pity or an argument from compassion? So in this paper, what I say, you often might want to do when you're just focusing on a topic into which a particular moral question rises and you don't have the time or the space or whatever to answer a moral question. It's not my purpose in this paper to debate between the answers of whether or not the two moral questions, again, those moral questions are, does embryonic stem cell research kill human persons? And is it morally permissible to kill some human persons in order to help other persons who are suffering from debilitating disease? So it's not my purpose to answer those questions, although my own view is to the first question, yes. It is all acts of stem cell research, embryonic stem cell research that intentionally take the life of the embryo are going to be evil actions. They kill innocent people, and I have another argument for that view on this channel if you want to check that out. And the other moral question is it morally permissible to intentionally kill some human persons in order to help other persons who are suffering from a disease? I think the answer is no to that, too. So if you want to know my views on that, there they are. But in the paper here, my purpose is not to answer that question in any detail or enter into that debate right now. So my purpose here is to propose this point. Determining how to tell in specific cases whether an argument is informally fallacious requires much more than simple textbook definitions, even when those definitions are followed with textbook cases. Deciding in this case whether or not the political advertisement is fallacious requires the kind of practical wisdom which is able to answer specific moral questions such as, what is a human person? Or who is a human person? Can some persons be destroyed in order to help others? Right? Those questions, without the answers to those, you can't look at that ad and say one way or the other without first answering those questions, whether that's a fallacious appeal to pity or a reasonable argument from compassion. To return to Aristotle, finding the answers to such questions will require hard work for any student of argumentation or logic. It will require, as Aristotle says, quote, a quality of mind concerned with things just and noble and good for man, end quote. Now, how that happens is of great concern, not only for students of argumentation, but also for those who teach it. Yet it must be done, if Aristotle is right, that we can have practical wisdom, if and only if we are morally good. So here's some, let me turn now a corner here in this paper and talk a little bit about some of the challenges to teaching fallacies, even with phronesis. So even if you have phronesis, practical wisdom, there's still going to be some challenges to teaching fallacies. Trudy Govier, this is an older article from the 80s, wonderful decade, by the way. In her article, quote, the title of which is, Who Says There Are No Fallacies? In that paper, she argues persuasively against the idea that there are no informal fallacies at all, and thus they simply can't be taught at all, even if practical wisdom is had by someone analyzing a particular fallacy. Govier identifies at least 3 problems of teaching fallacies. These problems, if left unaddressed, could lead one to the conclusion that fallacies just aren't real or important when teaching the basics of logic. So the first problem is what she calls the standards problem. First problem of teaching fallacies is what I call this the standards problem. And Govier identifies this problem in this way. She writes, in order to say that reasoning is characterized in bodies of mistake, it may be necessary to invoke a standard of good reasoning. Thus, it is no simple matter to demonstrate that someone has argued in such a way as to have committed a fallacy. This point, which should be remembered, is of considerable pedagogic significance and may be an important reason against trying to teach critical skill by teaching fallacies. This is kind of opposition to teaching fallacies here. That's the end of the quotation. Govier doesn't address this problem as thoroughly as she does the others listed below in her paper, but I believe this problem may be a specific case of relativism about knowledge. Relativism is always lurking around, or about logic itself. It's been my experience that relativism is a problem for many students, not only in teaching ethics, where you'd expect it to show up, but also in logic, especially critical thinking. When I ask students whether or not there are right ways to think, they generally say no. Govier's correct that if there are mistakes, i.e. fallacies in reasoning, then there must be correct ways of reasoning, which does require a standard of good reasoning. In order to ameliorate that problem, I suggest a two-pronged strategy with students. First, demonstrate the problems of relativistic thinking. For example, it's self-refuting, etc. Second, show that there are in fact reasonable standards for good reasoning, such as those required of the traditional square of opposition and deduction, like non-contradiction, or coherence, or probability, a general inductive concept of inductive strength or weakness. These concepts, while they can be debated among philosophers, do have prima facie common sense reasonableness to them, which can be validated in countless individual experiences. Presenting these to students can move the ball forward in learning that 1, it is possible that there are right and wrong ways to think by refuting relativism, and 2, fallacies don't meet reasonable standards apparent in common sense and traditional views of deduction and induction. This may help them on their way to obtaining the third and crucial thing discussed above, which is practical wisdom. Right. Now, there's another problem. It's called the limitation problem that Govier points out. The limitation problem is a problem which arises from the mistaken view that logical analysis is limited to formal deductive analysis. I believe this problem is a vestige of logical positivism and any program seeking to reduce thought to language, language to symbols, and symbols to matter. Logic seems to be broader than deductive and not on the surface reducible to the linguistic. This is an idea partly I get from Dallas Willard's old paper called The Absurdity of Thinking in Language. Great little paper, by the way. I need to do a video on that. So Govier analyzes Lambert and Ulrich's claim in The Nature of Argument, it's a book on this topic, that the only form of logic that only deductive analysis is worthwhile. That's all you need is deduction. Love and deduction. Okay, that's all you need. Those authors argue that studying fallacies does not help students to learn reasoning skills because reasoning is solely or primarily deductive in nature. However, according to Govier, this seems unfairly to limit reason to deduction, specifically deductive logical structure rather than inductive analogical or logical content. Govier argues that good reasoning does include non-deductive reasoning, and much of the study of informal fallacies can fall into these other areas. In addition, she argues that even in deductive analysis, fallacies can be informal. For example, what is commonly called the false dichotomy or false dilemma can occur in valid instances of a disjunctive syllogism. So that's going to be a major problem too, sorting that out. Here's a third problem. It's called the interpretive problem. Govier cites Finocchiaro, who asks, quote, "The problem I wish to raise here is, do people actually commit fallacies as ordinarily understood? That is, do fallacies exist in practice, or just in textbook? Do they exist only in the mind of the interpreter who's claiming that a fallacy is being committed?" Let's call this the interpretive problem. This problem centers on the issue faced by many after being familiarized with quite a few textbook examples of common fallacies. They begin to see fallacies everywhere they look. It's like playing a video game, you start seeing it in your head all over. However, perhaps there's something one could call an argumentum ad fallaciam. I'm sure this is not an original idea to me, but not sure to whom to attribute it. This fallacy would be committed when an arguer attempts to refute another argument by mistakenly or wrongly accusing it of committing a fallacy. when in fact it does no such thing. Of course, this could occur in a simple interpretive mistake. An arguer does not carefully consider both the context of an argument, an arguer's meaning, and the structure of an argument itself. This interpretation can be botched and the argumentum ad fallaciam committed. Regarding the interpretive problem, Govier also points out that in practice it's often difficult to tell whether people are offering arguments or not. That's a good question, right? An argument can't be fallacious, or a set of statements can't be fallacious if it's not even an argument. It's entirely possible that some alleged appeals to force and pity are most plausibly interpreted in a way that does not make them out to be arguments. That's end quote there from Govier. So Govier responds to this interpretive problem raised by Finocchiaro by stating, that was a quote by Govier. So Govier responds to the interpretive problem raised by Finocchiaro by stating, we should see that there is a fair interpretive basis for regarding an arguer as having offered an argument, and we should try to get some sense for the certainty with which the arguer wishes to assert their conclusion. Sensitive interpretation is a basic component of good argument assessment, and it's a skill underemphasized in much standard pedagogy. End quote. Govier suggests that something like the principle of charity in interpreting arguments can be helpful in solving the interpretive problem. Again, that seems like it's going back to Phronesis. So how do you teach fallacies? Well, philosophers have been teaching their students to avoid mistakes in reasoning since the beginnings of Western philosophy. The teaching of logical fallacies can be traced back to Aristotle's sophistical refutations. It seems that the ability to reason poorly has been with us for a very long time. Aristotle is dealing with the same issues that arise in 20th century textbooks. And in Aristotle's work, he claims that, quote, for some people it's better worthwhile to seem to be wise than to be wise without seeming to be. But for those who would be reasonable, quote, it is the business of one who knows a thing himself to avoid falsities in the subject which he knows, and to be able to show up the man who makes them, end quote. Aristotle cites fallacies which, quote, depend on the assumption of the point at issue, quote, for example, what we call begging the question. Aristotle argues against fallacies which quote, depend on treating as a cause that which is not a cause, end quote. For example, the false cause fallacy. Aristotle argues against fallacies which depend on homonymy and ambiguity, what we call modern-day fallacies of equivocation and amphibole. Aristotle argues against those, quote, refutations which make several questions into one, end quote. Complex question. So from Aristotle, antiquity, to the most recent editions of logic and critical thinking textbooks, fallacies have been taught as mistakes to be avoided. There remain philosophical questions about the place of teaching fallacies should have in full courses in critical thinking. First, should they be taught at all? Second, if so, how? One approach is to take what you might call a minimalist approach. Okay, so this is from a text by David Hitchcock from the 90s. Hitchcock argued that teaching fallacies should be, at best, taught very minimally. He argues that there are areas of fallacious deception in ordinary discourse, but the best way to teach students to avoid fallacies is not simply through an enumeration and exemplification of mistaken modes of reasoning. I might be guilty of that. He makes an analogy with sports. Teaching fallacies is, quote, like saying that the best way to teach somebody to play tennis without making the common mistakes is to demonstrate the faults in action and give them the label and respond to them. Okay, here's the things you don't do, and then just have them understand all of it. Hitchcock argues that it makes more sense to teach the analytical apparatus for correct reasoning than to begin with fallacies. I like that sports analogy. That's a good one. But is it limited solely to those courses or texts which only teach critical thinking or reasoning skills by means of fallacy identification and analysis? Hitchcock indicates that a teacher ought to be one who should focus on, quote, how to do it correctly, end quote. So I agree with Hitchcock there. In my courses, antecedently to teaching fallacies, I expect students to have some facility in argument identification and analysis of deductive validity using traditional Aristotelian deduction. Probably a skill we need to have more of. Even if an AI can do it for you. I mean, don't you want to know what you're thinking about? Or reasoning about? An additional concern raised by Hitchcock is that focusing on fallacies can foster in students, quote, an attitude of looking for the mistake and of stopping once it has found something that one can pin a fallacy label on, rather than coming to grips with the substance of what one is discussing. Now, I can attest to this in my own teaching of fallacies, especially when using video clips, which limit the range of discussion to a rather brief 1 to 2 minute sound bites. This problem can be solved in several ways. First, having students watch an entire debate in context and identifying fallacies which occur within that context. Second, having students write out an argument with clear premises and a conclusion in order to show that the arguer is arguing, how the arguer is arguing, so that the charitable interpretation of an argument can be assessed. Okay, so that's the minimalist approach, and maybe some ways to think about it. Here's another option, which is called the non-minimalist approach. This is by a philosopher named Anthony Blair. Suggests that one way to approach teaching fallacies consists in, quote, supplying paradigm examples and by identifying the typical conditions constitutive of the fallacies in question. However, Blair indicates that alongside teaching fallacies, one must simultaneously introduce, quote, the cogent arguments that the fallacious ones approximate or counterfeit, and the principles of their cogency, end quote. And now this will allow students to identify fallacies and know the difference between those that are not fallacious. So Blair's suggestion then does some work in overcoming Hitchcock's concern about teaching fallacies in the analogy of sports. One can do both. You can show common mistakes, how to avoid them in the context of the right moves of the game. In addition, you can avoid the interpretive problem above by having a facility for good argument construction, which allows one to have the ability to interpret other arguments for their strength or weakness. Now, Blair concludes that there are three options for teaching fallacies in critical thinking type courses. First, he advocates that the teaching of fallacies in courses that are designed around them is a good thing. Second, he advocates teaching a few fallacies in a course that is not designed around them. Third, he does not advocate teaching fallacies as a separate short unit in a course in argumentation or reasoning. He believes that, due to the complexity, the need for qualifications, the need for practice and coaching, fallacies cannot be taught well in a small portion of a course on reasoning or argumentation. He claims, and this is a long quote from Blair, a 2 or 3 lecture packet risks educational irresponsibility. Very strong claim. No 2 or 3 week unit can do them all justice. Almost certainly more harm than good is done in briefly sketching a distortingly oversimplified conception of a fallacy, ignoring or understanding the difficulties of interpreting working arguments, and in rushing over the careful discriminations and qualifications that are part of appropriate argument evaluation using fallacies, end quote. So I agree with Blair on this general point. I think this is an important general point that Blair is making within a discussion of how to teach fallacies. Rushing through teaching fallacies, as does rushing through teaching anything in philosophy, is harmful for students. A 1 or 2 day lecture on 10 or more fallacies would not be particularly helpful to students. In my courses, I usually spend 4 to 5 weeks on 5 fallacy types with about 20 fallacies covered. Now, I've also taught courses where I do about 10 weeks on 15 or so fallacies, right? So maybe 20, but maybe 2 a week, for 12 weeks or something. That's 10 weeks, right? That's a lot, but at least it's a little slower pace. This is meant as an introduction to fallacious forms of reasoning and doesn't require careful coaching and analysis of fallacious arguments, especially with respect to the issue of interpretation. So let me conclude this. I believe that with careful interpretive training, by using concrete examples from ordinary discourse, including videos of debates and commercials, maybe TikTok, sort of things, YouTube videos, all of that, students can receive an initial training that allows them to have the beginnings of discriminatory abilities to distinguish between good arguments which might appear at first glance to be fallacious and those which really are fallacious. In some cases, the question of fallaciousness of an argument is a matter of debate, as we've seen above. This analysis and debate itself can be a useful heuristic device, challenging students to give good, i.e. non-fallacious arguments for their positions on why a particular argument should be understood as fallacious or not. This is a type of habituation and practice required for the kind of phronesis and practical wisdom that our world so desperately needs. Thanks for watching.
Stay psyched, Grom.